So, one thing I often hear is that once you learn a language to decent proficiency, when you go to learn another language after that, so your third language, it becomes a lot easier. Just because the first time you're learning a language, you still haven't really worked out how to learn. So, with the first language you learn, you sort of have to spend a lot of time experimenting with different methods and different ways of learning until you find what works. And when you go to learn another language after that, you've already worked all that out. So you don't have to go through that process again. You can get right into it and learn it much more efficiently. So this is actually true, right? When you look at it in terms of how many hours will it take, how many hours do you have to put in to reach a decent level, the second language is probably going to require a lot fewer hours to actually get there, just because you've already worked out that process of how to learn. However, I actually think learning a third language is a lot harder than learning your second language, just because actually putting in those hours becomes a lot more difficult. And this is based on my own experience, but I've also noticed that a lot of people who have already learned a foreign language to a high level and then went on to try and learn a different language after that, I've observed personally that a lot of people seem to be having a similar issue. So for those of you who aren't familiar with my channel, I spent a good 6 years learning Japanese relatively intensively with a lot of input and eventually a lot of speaking and in-country immersion as well. And after those 6 years, I decided I wanted to learn Thai as well. So I started learning Thai, but I find I just haven't been able to put in the amount of time or the amount of hours or dedication that I managed to put into Japanese the first time. And that's not because I'm less interested in the culture and the language, because that's not the case, right? But it's more simply because it's a lot more difficult to repeat the process, I find. So probably the main reason is that the first time you learn a foreign language, right, there's a massive period at the start. So it was probably a good 1 or 2 years for me before you actually start enjoying the language, right? So at the start, you're getting a lot of input. Maybe, a lot of people are sort of trying to interact with natives, but it's a very painful, frustrating experience, and it requires enormous patience. Just because you still can't understand, and you might be immersing in stuff that you can only half understand still, and it's not really that fun most of the time, right? You kind of have to really force yourself to sit down, to pay attention, and to really just push through that initial stage to get to the point where you can actually start enjoying the language. It did take me a good few years of really just enormous effort and patience until I could actually enjoy, the fruits of all that effort that I put into it. And then once you go to learn another language, right, then it's back to square one. So it feels like with the first time I learned a language, right, if you imagine it to, say, climbing a mountain, it's like I put in all this effort and dedication to get right to the top of the mountain, right, and you finally reach the precipice, and you're enjoying, the amazing view from the peak. And then all of a sudden, you're back at the base of the mountain, looking up at the peak again and thinking, fuck, I'm going to have to do all this again. And I think, you have to be a special type of masochist to really go through that process all again voluntarily. And now this time as well, you understand how long it actually takes. So the first time you learn a language, you're kind of deluded in a sense as to just how long it takes to learn and to understand and to speak at a good level. And it's a little bit contradictory because on one end, right, you don't have the experience of succeeding. So in some ways you kind of doubt the process. You're like, is this really going to work? It doesn't feel like it's working. But on the other hand, right, you're also thinking, well, it couldn't take that long, right? And then afterwards, right, you succeed and you realize it is possible, you can do it, but it also takes a lot longer than you would have expected. So that now when you go to learn another language, you do have that confidence that you can succeed, but at the same time, you're just acutely aware of how long and how painful the process is at first, right? To actually get to the points where you can enjoy the fruits of all your effort. And it's really hard to keep up the motivation to go through all that again when you've already done it once. And also with Japanese, I finally got to the point where, like English, I just, it's actually really enjoyable to consume input and content in that language. So, I mean, when I'm consuming content in Japanese, it's not because it's in Japanese, it's just because it's interesting to me, right? So when I'm watching something on YouTube, I'm watching it purely because it captured my attention and it made me want to watch that video. It's got pretty much nothing to do with the language now. So now it's like, well, do I want to watch something in Thai that's probably not going to interest me that much, or I might not understand that much? Or do I want to watch something in English or in Japanese that I can really enjoy? And the first time with Japanese, I actually kind of made quite a few sacrifices. At that time, I was scheduled to study abroad in Japan, right? So I really wanted to take a good year to dedicate my life to Japanese. So that meant that I wasn't consuming a lot of English input, and I also put a lot of my other hobbies kind of on the back burner a bit, just so I could really focus and nail down Japanese before I studied abroad. Now, that study abroad plan fell through because of COVID, but on the other hand, because of COVID, it gave me a lot more time as well to focus on Japanese for a good year or so, quite intensively. And then eventually I did reintegrate all those other hobbies and English and everything back into my life. So now I'm at the point where I've reintegrated all that stuff into my life, but I don't want to just sacrifice all that stuff again just so I can learn another language. So it is difficult in that way, and I have noticed a lot of other people who sort of, put in all that time and effort to get really proficient in a foreign language. And then usually people who do that are very interested, in other languages as well. So they'll try to learn another language, but they can't seem to replicate that success. Or even if they do, it takes significantly longer compared to the first time, just because, the amount of time you can allocate to it isn't the same. And in my life, I'm in a different situation too as well, right? So back then I was a student, and these days I feel like I want to enjoy my life more, right? And I have all these hobbies, and I'm kind of at the point where I don't want to sacrifice, the enjoyment of my life just to really, refine a skill or to become really good at something. So I definitely do want to continue. But, with Thai, I've only been putting in maybe on average an hour a day. And for a European language, right, I've heard that with an hour a day, you can actually make pretty decent progress. But with an Asian language, right, like Thai or Japanese, it's just not going to happen, right, if you're putting in an hour a day. To actually get to the point where you can understand native speech relatively well and you can, converse with people. But that's another thing too. So the way I prefer to learn languages is to get a lot of input at first and then get to the point where I can understand a decent amount of what the other person's saying before I actually go to speak, because I just find that to be a much smoother process. But it also means that the initial stages can be a little bit boring just because you don't have that interaction. With Japanese, I just kind of pushed through that. I remember just forcing myself to sit down and watch, Japanese TV dramas for like 2 or 3 hours a day. Sometimes I'd be so bored, but I just would force myself to sit there and concentrate on what's happening, right? Whereas I just don't have that patience now. I find now, like even just 1 hour, I'm done. And not to mention, I'm not at the point where I can actually listen to something and understand enough of it to actually enjoy it if it doesn't have visuals as well. So content with visuals is a lot more understandable. When I was doing Japanese though, I just used to put headphones in and I would keep listening and listening all day even though I didn't understand. I just find I can't do that now, I don't have the patience anymore to just, do stuff that I really don't enjoy doing. But even with an hour a day, right, it's not like I'm not progressing at all. I do realize just how long it's going to take. If I keep going at the current rate, it could be like 5-10 years before I actually reach a decent level. But I'm in it for the long run, So I'm just going to keep going, see how it goes. Anyway, I'm really interested to hear other people's experiences. So please, let me know in the comments if you have an experience learning getting to a decent level in a foreign language and then trying to replicate those results with a different language afterwards, and if you had any trouble or... but anyway, let me know your own experiences, and thanks for watching.